Before diving into this incredible story, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell. Every story here has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. Mark Delorme had never really believed in miracles. It wasn't that he rejected them violently, no. He simply classified them among the naive sweetness reserved for children or wounded hearts. He had learned very early on that life only yielded to logic, effort, and patience. He had grown up in a concrete housing project in Argenteuil, raised by a single mother, a cleaning lady in a tower block in La Défense. The miracle, for her, was that he brought home good grades despite the electricity being cut off and the cupboards being empty. For Mark, it was surviving school without giving in to easy shortcuts. So he had built his life like one erects a building, meter by meter, year after year. Engineering studies, poorly paid internships, sleepless nights learning safety standards and the properties of cement. He had learned to trust equations, what can be calculated, what can be proven. Chance, for him, was just a name given to what one hadn't yet mastered. His apartment, on the 5th floor of a plain building, was nothing spectacular, but he knew every screw, every plank. He had chosen it for its unobstructed view and its exposure to the morning sun. It was logical, functional, healthy. So was his life. And then, one day, Lila arrived. He hadn't understood right away. It wasn't shock, nor the cliched emotion of distraught fathers. It was more subtle, deeper, as if someone had slipped light into the blind spots of his life. Since birth, Mark had slowly discovered a fragility he had never tolerated. Lila had changed the center of gravity of his universe without saying a word. He loved those moments in the morning, when everything was still asleep, when he carefully wrapped Lila in the baby sling against his chest and silently descended the stairs. He cherished that silence between them. He called it their silent ritual. It was their world, a world without schedules, without phones, without plans to finalize. That morning, a simple Sunday in spring, nothing seemed to indicate that the balance was about to tip. It was 9:43 a.m. He had mechanically checked the time as he left the apartment. Lila had woken up earlier than usual. He had changed her, fed her, then tucked her into his cuddle. She had that attentive gaze of an infant, curious about the world but always riveted to the familiar beat of their father's heart. Lyon Blum Park was a few minutes away. The trees there had begun their slow awakening. The sun pierced through the foliage, casting patches of light across the paths. Mark walked slowly, savoring the calm. He hadn't turned on his phone. He wanted to enjoy himself. He stopped near the duck pond. A small group of sparrows hopped near a bench. Lila chattered softly, her head turned toward the water. Mark placed a hand on her back, an instinctive, tender, protective gesture. With the other hand in his pocket, he breathed deeply. Then, suddenly, everything changed. A sudden, sharp pain pierced his chest. At first, he thought it was simple muscle tension, perhaps a bad sleeping position. But the pain intensified, gripping his ribcage like a vice. A violent heat radiated into his left arm. He tried to inhale, but his breath caught in his throat. A dizziness. No, not now. The ground seemed to move away. His knees buckled. His only instinct was to hold Lila close, with all his remaining strength, as if his body knew he shouldn't let go. The world became a blur. The sounds of the park faded. It collapsed slowly, like a tower cracking in slow motion. His face touched the cool grass. Everything went dark, but Lila was still there, huddled against his weakened heart, alive, safe, and ready, without knowing it, to do the impossible. She could have remained silent, curled up against that suddenly motionless chest, sought the warmth of his skin, waited in silence. She could also have cried like all babies her age, reflexively, with no real awareness of the tragedy. But what Lila did, in that moment suspended in time, exceeded anything one would have expected of a 6-month-old infant. She let out a scream that was anything but ordinary, not a simple wail of hunger or fatigue. It was a howl, long, piercing, wild, almost inhuman, a scream that split the morning air like shards of glass. There was in it an ancient panic, a visceral anguish, an almost spiritual urgency, as if, deep within her, something, an old soul, a forgotten memory, understood what was happening. The birds suddenly flew off from the nearby branches. A dog in the distance stopped dead in its tracks. The wind even seemed to hold its breath. In the park path, a jogger slowed, a shiver running up the back of her neck like a cold shock. She froze. This scream wasn't normal. There was a distress in the sound that pierced reason. A plea. What is? She turned her head, searching for the source. And she saw it. A man, lying in the grass, his face turned toward the ground, his arms still folded around a small, agitated body. At first, she thought he was homeless or asleep. But the rigidity of his posture, the lack of movement, the bluish tint of his skin, this wasn't sleep. She ran. She was a former nurse, trained in emergency care, well-versed in life-saving techniques. She had seen cardiac arrests on construction sites, in hospital corridors, on the asphalt after an accident. But here, in the middle of the bucolic calm of the park, with only the birdsong and a baby's cries as alarm bells, the contrast was striking. She knelt in the grass without wasting a second. Her hand rested on the back of Mark's neck. No pulse. No breathing. Her instincts took over. "Call the ambulance," she shouted to a woman in the distance. Quick. Her fingers were barely trembling. She quickly undid the baby's sling, freeing Lila, who was still screaming, her face red, her eyes wild with anguish. She handed the little girl to a passerby, a young mother with a stroller, tears in her eyes. "Hold her. Speak to her softly. She needs to stay calm." Then she placed her hands on Mark's chest. 1, 2, 3, 4. Time became a thick pool. The minutes no longer passed. They stretched like molten lead. Her forehead beaded with sweat. She counted the compressions in a low voice, to keep the rhythm, to keep from panicking. "Stay with us. Go. Go." 12 minutes. That's how long it took for help to arrive. 12 minutes of a fierce struggle against death. 12 minutes during which Mark's heart stopped beating, but his arms held on to his daughter. When the paramedics took over, she finally stepped back. Trembling, exhausted, she looked at Lila, in the young woman's arms, now at peace, as if her role was over. At that precise moment, Elise, at home, was getting ready to get out of bed. Mark's absence was beginning to worry her. He never stayed this long during their morning walks. She sat on the edge of the bed and glanced at her phone. No notifications. Then it vibrated. Unknown number. "Good morning, madam," said a calm but serious voice. "I'm an emergency room doctor. Your husband just had a cardiac arrest in Leon Blum Park. He's alive, but we're going urgently to Beaujon Hospital. We have to get there quickly, and your daughter is with us. She's fine." Elise felt the ground give way. Her vision blurred. Her whole body suddenly became too heavy. It took her a few seconds to comprehend the words, alive. Emergency. Hospital. Baby. Her hand gripped the phone tightly. She ran. She doesn't remember closing the door behind her. At Beaujon Hospital, the wait was torture. Mark had suffered a massive heart attack, with no warning signs. It took 3 defibrillator shocks to restart his heart. He was in a light coma, under constant observation. The doctors were cautious. They weren't promising anything. The next 48 hours would be decisive. But Lila was fine. She didn't have a single scratch. Her tiny body hadn't suffered any shock, any fall, as if protected by her father's arms until the very end. And when Elise, pale, her eyes puffy with fear, arrived at the hospital, it was the jogger, still there, still upset, who approached her with sudden tenderness. "Your daughter," she screamed so loudly. That's what saved him. Without that scream, I would never have turned around. No one would have seen him there, half hidden by the bushes. That baby, she saved her father. She screamed for life. A thick silence followed. Elise looked at her daughter, asleep in a hospital blanket. A silent angel. And in that silence, she knew a miracle had just happened. A miracle born from a scream. A cry of light. 3 days later, in a room bathed in dim light, Mark finally opened his eyes. It was a fragile, almost timid awakening, like a butterfly gently emerging from its cocoon. He blinked several times, adjusting to the brightness. His lips barely moved. "What happened?" he whispered, his voice hoarse and choked with weakness. Elise, sitting next to him, raised her head, her eyes shining with a mixture of fatigue, relief, and an emotion that was hard to contain. She gently stroked Mark's cheek. "You fell in the park. You had a heart attack. It was serious, very serious." "But Lila," she screamed so loudly, Dad. So loudly that the whole park heard. "A nurse arrived just in time. She saved you. But, you know, it was mostly her. Our little girl, she was the one who kept you alive." Mark slowly turned his head toward the rocking chair on the armchair beside the bed. Lila was asleep, wrapped in a soft blanket, her tiny fingers barely gripping the fabric. Her innocent face seemed unreal, suspended between fragility and strength. A new weight settled in Mark's chest, not a physical pain, but a deep, overwhelming emotion. His heart, still fragile, beat weakly, but his mind felt a new strength. This tiny being, unable to speak, unable to understand, had nevertheless achieved the impossible, bringing back to life the one who had held him close to his heart. Mark, a Cartesian, pragmatic, and logical man, could not rationally explain this miracle. Yet, he felt it deep within his being. It was no accident, nor a mere coincidence. It was a sign, an invisible but powerful bond between a father and his daughter, a call to never lose hope. For the next 3 weeks, Mark remained in intensive care and rehabilitation. His heart remained fragile, subject to the doctor's meticulous attention. They discussed interventions, precautions, and patience. Mark listened, sometimes distracted, but obeyed. Each day, he found himself looking at Lila a little longer, marveling at her gestures, her smiles, however small. Little by little, something inside him changed. He decided to slow down the hectic pace of his life as an engineer. Deadlines, projects, and daily stress became less important. He spent more time with his daughter, holding her close, looking at her like a living miracle. And for the first time, he began to write letters to Lila. Simple, sincere words, stories of love, gratitude, promises. He wanted her to know, one day, when she grew up, to understand how much that cry she couldn't even remember uttering, had saved not only her father, but their entire family. 10 years later, Lila, now a little girl full of life and imagination, often told this story to her schoolmates. She didn't remember this episode, of course, but she was proud of it. With the innocence of children and the certainty that comes from family stories, she would declare to anyone who would listen, "I'm the one who saved Dad when I was a baby." Her smile widened, lighting up her face with a sweet, bright pride. Mark, sitting on a bench in Leon Blum Park, listened to her with a smile on his lips, his heart swollen with emotion. He gently stroked the small pendant he always wore around his neck, a miniature imprint of Lila's hand, taken that day, at 6 months old, at the moment she had cried. Not a simple cry, a miracle,